The use context hook is the most important hook in React when it comes to managing global state. And in this video, I'll teach you everything that you need to know about the use context hook so that you can start using it in your React projects to manage global state. So let's first see the problem that we have, and then we will solve this problem by making use of the use context hook. So right here, I have this application and we have our app component right here, and we have several components. So we are passing this homepage component, and in homepage component, we are passing our profile component, and in profile component, we are passing the settings component. And finally, in settings component, we have this information which we see right here. So at our app, we have this particular piece of state, and I want to render this email at our settings. So how can I do that? One of the straightforward way is through passing the props. So we can pass email through props up to our settings. Let's do that here. I can just say here email, and I'll set this to be equal to our email like that. And I'll just copy this one right here because I'll need it. Save that file, come to homepage. We pass this again right here, but also make sure to destructure the email from props. So here I destructure email and I save there. Then in profile, I can start by destructuring the email like that, and we pass it via props to our settings. And in settings, we can destructure that email again here, email, and we can now finally be able to render the user email right here. And I go ahead and save. And once I save, you'll see that it is right here now. So this process of passing the data via props like this, we pass it from app to homepage component, from homepage component to profile component, from profile component to settings component, and then finally we get where we need it. It's called props drilling. And props drilling can get very hectic, especially in large applications. So imagine we had like 15 components and we have to pass the email through each of the components. So that will be a lot of work. So in big applications, props drilling is not a very nice thing, okay? It can get messy very quick. So this is where the use context hook comes in. It is used to access some form of global state, and we can be able to use that state easily in any of the components directly without going through this props drilling thing, okay? So what do we need to do? The first thing that I'll do is that I'll come right here and I'll create a new file, and I'll call this one app context.jsx. And right here, I'll create an app context that will help us to manage the state. I can just say const app context will be equal to create context. So this is a function that comes from React, and we invoke that. Here by default it will be undefined, but you can usually pass any default state that you want right here, okay? But for now, I'll just set it to be undefined like that. And I want to also go ahead and export this app context like that. So the use context hook is not usually used alone. It is used together with this create context or the context API in React to handle the global state, okay? This app context has what we call app context.provider component, and that is what we usually wrap our different components that will consume our app context state with. So what I mean is that right here, we can wrap this homepage with app context. Right here, I import it .provider component like that. And I pass this homepage right here like that. And this app context.provider usually accepts a value prop. And in this value prop, you can pass the data that will be accessible from the child components. So these child components include this homepage component and any other component that is a child of this homepage. So we will be able to access this value from any of these other components: homepage, profile, settings, and so on. I'll go ahead and remove this props drilling thing, what we had done before. So I will remove that, and make sure to save this file. I'll go to homepage and I will remove all this props drilling that we had done here because we will no longer need them. And you can see now this component is much cleaner. Then we need to also remove from here. So let's remove this props drilling here and I'll save. And let's go to settings, and now we will not access our value like this. Okay, now here we will actually make use of the use context hook. So I'll just say const email is equal to use context. Now this is our hook. Then we invoke it and we pass app context. We pass this particular app context right here. So I say app context. And once I do this use context will get us the email that we pass right here as the value. Okay, and with that we'll be able to render it right here, and you can see we are successfully being able to render the email. So if I come to the app right here and we happen to change this email to, let's say, test, and I happen to save, look, we are easily able to access it like that. So what have we done? The first thing, we have created a context using this create context from React, and this is now like the context API. We get this app context and we are also exporting it. So once we export, that app context has a component called app context.provider, and we pass the values that will be accessible from any other component in our tree that we wrap right here. So we can access it easily even in our profile. So right here in the profile, I can also come here and say const email will be equal to, we call our use context hook like that, we invoke it, and we can be able to pass our app context. And just like that, we have our email right here without going through that props drilling stuff. And right here we can say we are at the profile, and we can render the email to verify that we are actually getting the email. So I save, and look at profile, we have our email. So this makes it easy to access this particular state. It is now growable within our component tree. Another thing is that sometimes you might want to pass this data as an object because you have several states at our app right here. So let's say we were passing an email and a username. So what would we do if we wanted to pass that username here? So what we will do is that we can make this to be an object. So here I include the curly brackets, so we will be able now to pass the email and the username like that. But this will now throw an error. So at settings, we need to destructure now this from our app context. So we destructure that like that, and when I save, we are now able to access our email. If you want to access the username, you can just say username like that. You destructure it as well, and you can now be able to also maybe render the username right here. I'll just say username, and I'll go ahead and save. And look, we are able to read that username. So at our app right here, when passing the value, you can pass an object like this, and then you'll be able to pass a lot of state through that. Okay, so right here we might have a lot of state, making this app a component to be very heavy, and there is a simpler way of handling this. Okay, by removing this app context provider right here and this state to our app context file. So how can we do that? Right here, what we do, we create a component and we make sure to also export it. So I'll call this one const app context provider. So this is like a normal React component, and I'll set it to be an arrow function like this, and in here we usually return something. And now what we will return in this app context provider is this particular provider, app context.provider, together with the values. Okay, so what I'll do, I can actually copy the whole of this. So I'll copy, then I'll come here and I'll paste it here. But the problem is that we don't have this homepage right here, so I will remove that, and instead this app context provider will receive the children components. So this is the children prop, meaning that these are the child components which we will wrap with our app context.provider. So right here I pass the children, and now I save. And now this children, you can consider it as this homepage and all the other components that will be wrapped with our app context provider. So I can copy this. Instead now of saying app context.provider and then we pass the value, we will just wrap this homepage with this app context provider component which we have just created. So let me wrap it nicely like that and remove this one like that, and I save. But we have an error because in our app context provider we have this email and username, but they are not accessible from this file. So what we can do, we can just cut this state from there and we come right here and we paste it here, and then we make sure to import the useState hook in this particular file, and now I save. So I come here. Okay, let me remove the imports, and you can see now this app component is much simpler, just like that. It doesn't have a lot of pollution of state and so on, and we can now manage our whole state in our app context.jsx file. So at app we wrapped with this one, but we didn't import it. So let's import it, control space, and I import it, and I happen to save. And now look, we are able to still read our test at gmail.com, which is awesome. All we did is that we moved our logic now to our app context.jsx file, where we can manage the entire state right here, and we can pass that state through our values like this. And then at our settings, we read the state normally by calling our app context like this, which is awesome. There is usually one more issue that usually arises whenever we don't wrap our components with this particular app provider and we try to consume that app context at those components, then we get an error. What I mean is that if we remove this homepage from this wrap, so we are no longer wrapping our homepage with our app context provider, and I happen to save, look, we get an error and cannot destructure property of email of useContext as it is undefined. So we get that error. To get a proper error, people usually create a custom hook at our app context, and the custom hook looks like this. We'll say const use app context, and we set this one to be equal to an arrow function. And what we will do in this particular custom hook is that we will read the data normally like this. So I'll copy that and I'll paste it here. But now I don't want to destructure this. I just want to generalize that object as the app state. Okay, and we make sure to import this useContext hook from React. So we are bringing in useContext right here. We consume our app context by making use of this useContext, and right here we expect to get this object right here, which is our value. Okay, but if we don't wrap our component here with this provider, when we try to access in any of the child components, we will get that object as undefined. Okay, so what we usually do here is to perform a check. Does this app state exist? So we'll say, does this app state exist? So if it does not exist, we throw an error. So I can say throw new error, and here we can pass a better error message. We can say use app context like that must be used within the app context provider, And now this is a better error message that is telling us we are trying to make use of the use app context hook, which is our custom hook, in a component that is not wrapped with our app context provider. Okay, so how do we access the state with this use app context? We do that by just coming in the component where we need to access the data, like right here, and we'll just say use app context. So we should export it. Export this, save, come here, then make use of use app context like that, and we invoke it. Let's remove this one, and you can see we don't need to import the use context hook and the app context anymore from here, and we access it like this. But now when I save, we still have the error, but the error is different. And if I come down here to the last one, you'll see uncaught. Use app context must be used within app context provider. That means that we are trying to access our state, but these settings or any of its parent component is not wrapped with our app context provider. So right here, if we pass this correctly like that, we wrap our home page and we save. And right here, we happen to refresh. Okay, we still have an issue. Let's see what the issue is. We get that we cannot destructure the email from use app context because it is undefined. One thing that we didn't do is that we did not return this app state from our use app context. So after we get the state, we check if it is there or not. We should also make sure to return the app state. So right here, we return the app state like that. And I happen to save now, and there we go. Now we have our data being nicely rendered like that. We can easily make use of this use app context to access the state like this. Very easy. So here, if we wanted to access the username, we can just say const. We destructure the username from the state username, and we set this to be equal to use app context like that, and we invoke it, and just like that, we have our username here. Okay, and we can be able to render it to verify that. So we pass the username, and I happen to save, and look, just like that, we are able to access that data without going through that props drilling steps. Okay, and this is the main usage of the use context hook, to access the global state from our app context. And that is it about this video. If you learned something, leave a thumbs up, and also check my other hooks tutorial, and I'll leave a link to them at the description section below in a playlist. So I'll see you in the next one.